Hey guys, for my final presentation for Psych 413, I decided to focus on week 13's topic, which is the impact of stereotypes on children's behavior and their implications for academic achievement. So the first reading we read assigned in week 13 was by Mbadi et al. These researchers explored the effects of the activation of negative and positive stereotypes on children on their cognitive performance specifically. So they found that the activation of negative stereotypes impeded the children's performance, whereas activation of positive stereotypes improved performance. So more specifically, the researchers wanted to test the gender and ethnic differences in mathematics performance. Through their findings, it is evident that the stereotype susceptibility begins at an even younger age than we thought, as young as 5 years old. So they found that Asian American girls performed worse when their gender stereotype was activated versus their ethnicity. Compared to a control group, and Asian American boys performed better than the control group when either their gender or their ethnicity was activated. So interestingly, for children's ages 8 to 10, both boys and girls' performance in this group was improved upon gender activation compared to ethnic stereotype or control group counterparts. Additionally, in our second reading assigned for week 13, the impacts of stereotypes that later has been seen to predict math abilities is examined in preschool-age children. The researchers found that girls who associated math with boys performed worse on assigned number sense tasks, showing that stereotypes from even a young age can impair girls' intuitive number sense, which may have long-term effects on their acquisition of math concepts. So the first article that I did my own research on, called Stereotype Threat Among Girls, Differences by Gender Identity in Math Education Context by Cassatt et al. The researchers wanted to further the idea of stereotype activation in girls concerning math performance that we discussed in our second reading from week 13. They wanted to explore the underrepresentation of women and girls in STEM fields. So while in gender stereotypes impair preschool girls' intuitive number sense focused on the stereotype threat in preschool-age children, Cassatt et al. Elaborated on these effects of middle school children, and they added in the idea of gender identity as a protective or risk factor depending on the context. So they separated individuals in honors math and standard math classes, finding that gender identity was protective for girls in honors math for attitudes, discounting, and disengagement, but was a risk factor for math performance. Whereas girls in standard math classes, gender identity was a risk for disengagement and math attitudes, but did not affect their math performance. So this shows an interesting difference between contexts and the effects of the stereotype threat depending on these differing settings. Next, I read an article by Willie et al. Where they explore the effects of television on the perception that children have about gender roles. So they tested 335 fifth grade students on the effects that TV has on their perceptions of themselves in terms of gender roles and attitudes towards math. Their results showed that short-term effects of gender stereotypes, but they did not indicate that children's performance, motivational dispositions, or attitudes were strongly affected by the stereotypes presented long-term. However, in the experimental condition where they were exposed to the stereotype threat, both boys and girls reported higher endorsement of stereotypes compared to those in the control group. And finally, to understand not only the gender differences but also the cultural differences, I read Wasserberg's High Achieving African American Elementary Students' Perspective on Standardized Testing and Stereotypes, 2017. So he examines the stereotype threat in perceptions and experiences of African American students in terms of standardized testing. So there has been a large discussion about the gap in test scores of African American students compared to white students, and it's been a concern for a long time now. A lot of the theories take a cultural framework to understand this disparity, and many bring up negative judgments on the academic capabilities of African American students, which is obviously very problematic. So this results in the stigmatization of African American students, which predicts declines in the grades, self-concept, academic identification, and mental health of these students, causing there to be serious concern for the impact of stereotype and stereotype threat and activation of these stereotypes on African American individuals. So in my novel study, I want to examine the effects that the stereotype threat has on individuals in terms of gender identity, cognitive performance, and social media, combining some of the major questions posed by Willie et al., Wasserberg, and Cassatt et al. So while Willie et al. Examined the effects of TV on children's stereotype activation, there seems to be a gap in research and in literature about the effects that Instagram has on an individual's sense of self and self-efficacy related to gender stereotypes, because it's really important because Instagram is very, very prominent in young children's lives and our everyday lives. Younger children are obtaining smartphones and downloading this app, so I think it's important to look at how it's going to affect their perception of themselves and others. So my research question is, how does what we see on our Instagram feed affect our perception of ourselves, and what is the impact that this has on the activation of stereotype threat on young children and their general cognitive performance? So my participants would be children, grades 6 and 7, gathered with parental consent from my hometown of Tawasin. It's quite diverse in culture, but not much in terms of financial stability, so this could be a confounding variable. But perhaps if successful, this study could be done in lower income neighborhoods so that it could be made more generalizable. At this age of 11 to 13, most children already have smartphones and already have Instagram, so using the app or the device would not be a confounding variable. I would explain my intent to the parents and tell them that the results and the implications of the study would be shared with both them and the children after the study is conducted. Rather than this experiment running for a week or a month or longer, I would propose that it's run for 30 minutes for the first time to ensure that there are no short-term negative repercussions from this study and to negate any ethical concerns that some may have with me manipulating the content that the children are seeing on their phones. This takes a similar form to the time frame of Willie et al., where children were exposed to select television programs for 30 minutes. So everything will be done individually with a scripted researcher walking the children through each step of the process. First, I would conduct a pre-test questionnaire about sense of self and beliefs about their own success in the future and self-confidence using the Likert scale. I think that this would be the most effective way to measure the differences in attitudes about themselves and would be most accurate in terms of evaluation in the change of attitude. This template would have 20 to 30 questions asking about their sense of self, testing their confidence, what they believe they're capable of doing, etc., with some distractor questions. Next, they would do a general cognitive performance task used by Embody et al., which has already been tested for reliability in terms of what we're trying to measure, and validity. Next, we would have a control group who would scroll through a general feed of pictures on their Instagram on the phone that we have for them, looking at a general feed of images that are emotionally neutral, landscapes, gender neutral photos. So this would be the group that we control both experimental conditions to, and then we would have two experimental groups. The first one would be looking at images on their newsfeed where the majority of images are women learning, girls in school, women being in positions of power, motivational quotes geared towards women, links to various empowering stories about women. And then the second experimental group would be looking at images with the majority of boys learning, men in positions of power, boys going to school, stories about men succeeding. So in both experimental conditions 1 and 2, there would be both boys and girls exposed to each condition. So boys would be seeing boys succeed and girls would be seeing girls succeed, but boys would also be seeing girls succeed and girls would also be seeing boys succeed. So this would be to see the differential results between boys being exposed to the majority of girls' conditions and girls being exposed to the majority of boys' conditions. We would use random assignment from our pool of boys and girls in grades 6 and 7 to each of the 3 conditions. Then we would have a post-test questionnaire about the sense of self using the Likert scale again, and then another general cognitive performance task. After this, we would give a debrief explaining that there are no gender differences in intelligence, that the opportunities that one can gain is all about your abilities and not about your gender, just to control for any possible negative associations that the children have about themselves in terms of what they were exposed to during our study. So I hypothesize that those in their prime gender identity conditions, so boys seeing boys and girls seeing girls on their news feeds, will report a higher sense of self-efficacy and higher valued sense of self in terms of confidence and abilities. but that there will be no effects on cognitive performance tasks, and that those in the opposite gender condition, so boys seeing girls and girls seeing boys, will have a lowered sense of self, and there also will not be cognitive performance task disparities. Upon comparing the results for each group, I suspect that those exposed to the opposite gender would have a temporary lowered sense of self-efficacy, and less confidence in their own abilities, and then I would hypothesize that those exposed to the gender that they identify with would have higher scores on this. This being said, I don't think that the exposure to either newsfeed would have substantial effect on cognitive performance tasks, and I also do not believe that the lowered sense of self would be long-lasting or that it would cause any impairment to the children's future. I also think, though, that if children were exposed to this type of content for a long period of time, they do have the potential to chronically damage their sense of self and their self-esteem. Just because of the constant exposure or lack thereof of role models of their gender in education and specific fields of education, it could be quite damaging if this were to go on for a long period of time, which is why we chose to only do 30 minutes. Finally, I think that the implications of this study are really important when remembering all of the impacts, positive and negative, that social media can have on our sense of self, on the children of our future sense of selves, and the attitudes that we have about each other and ourselves in general. I think it could potentially have very damaging effects on stereotype threat, and it's really important to recognize how social media can shape our brains when we see something over and over again, especially for those who are young and impressionable and already struggling to find who they are in the world. I think that these implications could potentially lead to a change in Instagram algorithm. So the way it's formulated, perhaps, that I believe that one should be able to filter out seeing certain types of images. For example, young girls filtering out fitness Instagram models' bathing suit pictures as to not have like a ridiculously crazy standard for how they should look. But there's a long way to go before I see Instagram doing that. But I think in general, it's just really important to remember that we're being constantly exposed to things, and that these images and videos and things on our Instagram feeds, they all affect how we perceive things and how we perceive ourselves, and that we don't want it to let it get in the way of us believing in our true potential.